Yeah, it's going to start recording. I'm going to turn.
A book I read that actually Gretchen Niver, another member, lent to me. She said she thought it would interest me, and it did, enough so that I was willing to give a talk about this. So the title of the book is Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. The authors are Daniel Kahneman, Oliver Sibony, and Cass Sunstein. What was that? Kahneman is an emeritus professor of psychology at Princeton. He won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his work along with Amos Tversky in behavioral economics. Tversky, unfortunately, didn't win the share in the award because he had died by the time they issued the Nobel Prize. Sibony is a professor of strategy at the HEC Paris Business School, and he's also an associate of the business school at Oxford. Sunstein is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard. So it's a distinguished group of authors, a psychologist, a business professor, and an economist coming together to study this idea of noise and its effect on human judgment. Sorry, need this. Okay. It's not going to work. Well, that's okay. First of all, given that this is a group that studies ethics, what does judgment noise have to do with ethics? Well, again, as they argue in the book, if noise can be reduced in human judgments by some of the techniques I'll be describing, it will markedly increase the fairness for those individuals who get judged. And I'll give examples in a moment about the kinds of judgments that occur and how they affect the various individuals. So in the long run, we end up with a more ethical world as a result of increased fairness in judgments. Sorry, there we go. Okay, what is a judgment? What do we really mean by that? And then after I describe that, I'll talk about what do we mean by noise in judgment. So a judgment, as they describe this in the book, is a form of measurement in which the instrument is the human mind. So in making this measurement, if you will, a judge assigns a score to an object, but that's not necessarily a number exactly. Here's some examples. A doctor might make the judgment that the tumor that he's detected in a patient is a benign tumor. Or a personnel individual might make the decision that George is the best guy to hire for this job of the various people interviewed. Or an insurance adjuster might decide that the insurance premium on a new policy should be $12,000. Or a teacher says, Amy's essay gets an A. These are all forms of judgment. And in every one of these, you're assigning a score, in a sense, to that individual. Now, this book focused particularly on professional judges. That is, people who are making judgments and then decisions based on those judgments that are part of their profession. Doctors do this, lawyers do it, engineers do it, forensic analysis and crime detection. They do this, fingerprint analysis, for instance, DNA analysis. The teachers are constantly judging students in various ways. And there are many other examples I could give, but you can think of them yourself, certainly. So there are different kinds of judgments. I want to differentiate between predictive judgments and evaluative judgments, and then between verifiable judgments and unverifiable judgments. So an example of a predictive judgment that is also a verifiable judgment, tomorrow's temperature. You can't verify it today, but by the close of the day tomorrow, you will in fact know. So it's a verifiable judgment, a verifiable prediction. Or who will win, the Packer football game this afternoon? Again, you can make a guess, you can place a bet, and at the end of the day, you'll know whether you were right or wrong. How much inflation will there be next year? That's another predictive and verifiable judgment. Little different in that you won't be able to verify it for a year, but eventually you'll be able to verify it. Now, let's contrast that with a predictive and non-verifiable judgment. So let's say as a personnel recruiter, you're trying to judge the probability that a given individual will succeed on a job, will be able to do the job for which they were hired well. Now, that's non-verifiable. You might say, well, of course it's verifiable. You'll know in time whether that person succeeded or not. But note what you were asked to do. You were asked to give the probability of job success. And let's say I say, there's an 80% chance this person is going to do well on the job. So whether in fact they actually do well or do not, you really never know whether 80% was a good number. It could be in a sense a good number and you were just unlucky. The person failed for some reason that fell in that 20%. So that's a non-verifiable judgment. Any probability prediction is a non-verifiable judgment in the short run, at least. Insurance premiums, that's another example. A claims adjuster has to decide what's the appropriate premium for, say, fire insurance on a new building. They come up with a number, and that number actually might turn out to be too low, or it might be too high, costing the company. I mean, if it's too low, it might end up costing the company money. If it's too high, you might lose a customer. But again, whether that insurance premium is, quote, right in any sense, is just not verifiable. Another example, a different kind of unverifiable prediction is what I call it, or what they call in the book, a conditional prediction. So let's say somebody in the government, in the military, has to judge if we go to war with Iran, for instance, will we lose or will we win? Well, that judgment is verifiable only if, in fact, you go to war. But in the vast majority of cases where people make a judgment of that kind, we don't go to war. And so you never really know whether that judgment was a good one or not. So let's now talk about evaluative judgments. Everything I've been talking about up to now involved predictive judgments. But here are some evaluative judgments. Let's say a wine taster is tasting a best group of wines and picking out the best one in some sense. That's an evaluation. There is no way of verifying whether that in any objective sense is the right answer or not. Who gives sentences. Somebody's convicted of a crime and a judge says, okay, you get 2 years in prison for that. That's not a prediction, that's an evaluation. You've made a decision, but there's no way to verify that that decision is in any sense the right one. Evaluative judgments in general are non-verifiable by their nature, by definition almost. So, okay, that's what predictive judgments are. That's what a verifiable and unverifiable judgments are, and evaluative. let's go on. So now you have the sense of what I mean by a judgment. Now, what is noise in a judgment? Let's talk about that. Well, there are two things about a judgment. It can be biased, or it can be noisy. A biased judgment is really the average error in judgment, average error across judgments. So if a bunch of economists are predicting next year's inflation rate, they could be biased in that when you average all their judgments, they're quite low of what turns out to be the actual inflation rate. That would be a biased judgment. But they could also be very noisy. The judges may disagree, and some give very high estimates and some low, but the average of those estimates might turn out to be right on the button. So that would be a noisy judgment, but not a biased one. So just let me elaborate on that a little bit. Think of somebody shooting at a target, which is what you're really doing when you make a judgment. You have an imaginary target you think is the right judgment, and you're trying to get close to it. But there was one other item I wanted to mention before I get to that. I don't want to get into too much statistics because there's nothing that bores people more than statistics. I taught statistics. I know this for a fact. Statistically, bias is the average across all the judgments, whether multiple judgments by an individual or judgments across individuals. The mean of those judgments compared to the correct value in those cases where you know what the correct value is, that's the bias. The noise is, as they define it in the book, the standard deviation of those judgments. In other words, the mean square error or the variance, well, the square root of the variance, if you've had some statistics. In other words, you take each judgment, you compare it to the average. You don't compare it to the true target. You compare it to the average of those judgments, and then you square that, and you sum all those up and divide by the number of cases, so you get the mean, and then you take the square root of that. That is, by definition, the noise in that judgment. Yeah, so enough statistics for now. Let's go on a little bit. So again, imagine shooting at a target. Here are 5 shots on a target. If you look at these shots, there isn't much noise in them, and they're not biased either. There's very little bias. They're right on the button. Here's a noisier set of shots at the target, but they're not biased. If you take the average of those, they're still right on the target. Here is low noise, but bias. So all of the shooters were off for some reason. This is high noise and also bias. You got both here. Now, an important thing to realize about noise. Let's look at the back of the target where you can't see where the bullseye was. You can still say, you have no idea whether those shots are biased or not because you don't know where the bullseye in the target is. But you can measure the noise because the noise is measured against the mean of all those shots. And that you can compute. So you can measure noise when you don't know what the target is, what the true value of the judgment should be. You can't measure the bias directly, but you can measure the noise directly. And we'll come back to that. And just to finish this off, these two these two shot patterns, that one and that one, have low noise or high noise. Again, it can be measured, but you don't know about the bias. So this whole book focused on noise in judgments, not bias. They talk a little bit about bias, and I will, but that actually is a whole separate topic. The reason they felt it was worth writing a book about noise was because people are very sensitive to bias when they look at judgments, at people making judgments. They're very insensitive to noise. Noise just doesn't get much attention at all. But the fact is, noise is a very important component of judgments. And the more you know about noise and the more you can do to reduce it, the better your judgments will be. Okay. So let's look at some professional judgments that are known to have lots of noise in them. Here's an example. Medicine. Doctors making diagnoses or radiologists reading x-rays. I could give many more examples, but this is just a couple of them. Some data that is presented in the book. Skin melanomas, which are the most dangerous kind of skin cancer, are misdiagnosed 36% of the time. That's just a known fact about diagnoses of skin melanomas, because there are tests that can be done after a diagnosis to determine definitively whether a person really has a melanoma or not. And it turns out 36% of the time, the doctor making that judgment that there is or isn't a melanoma turns out to be wrong. Radiologists, again, looking at an x-ray to determine whether there's a tumor or not, for instance. Their false positives range from 0. There are some doctors who've been measured and they just don't make any mistakes, up to 50%. Other doctors who are wrong 50% of the time in claiming that there is, for instance, a tumor, and it turns out there really isn't one. Now, of course, part of that depends on a doctor's bias. If a doctor never says there's a tumor, he always said, I don't see a tumor, he'll never have any false positives. He'll be that doctor with 0, because he's very conservative about saying whether there's a tumor or not. Whereas a doctor who is very, very biased towards saying there are tumors has many more opportunities to be mistaken. Okay, anyway. So false positives, as I say, for radiologists range from 0 to 50%. False negatives, which is the opposite now, saying there isn't a tumor when in fact there really is one, range from, looking across doctors now, range from 1% up to 64%. And these are facts that have been measured in fairly recent studies. So these are known values. More disturbing is in another study that is reported in the book, 22 physicians disagreed with themselves between 63 and 92% of the time. That is, they were asked to make a diagnosis, and then some months later, as part of the study, they were shown the same data from the same patient, although the doctor looking at the data didn't know that fact, and they were asked to again make a diagnosis. Well, they changed their mind as to the diagnosis between 63 and 92% of the time. Hence the reason for getting second opinions. Yeah. Diagnoses really are noisy, and it's something everybody should be well aware of. Let's take another area. Let's look at child custody decisions. So a social worker has to make a judgment in court as to whether a child is at risk for abuse and should be placed into a foster home. Those judgments tend to be very, very noisy in the sense that different social workers will make different decisions, and there's very rarely consensus among a group of social workers on this. Another area, forecasts, such as economic predictions or task completion times. Some of you have managed groups where your group is given a task to do, and they have to tell you how long it's going to take them to do it. So they have to make a time estimate. Time estimates are notoriously both biased and noisy. They're biased in that they tend to be too low, almost always. And there's a lot of noise among the people making those estimates. So to give an example, there was a study done that found that task completion time estimates differed by 71% when software developers made estimates on 2 separate days. So a group of software developers were asked about a particular task to make an estimate, a future task that hadn't been undertaken yet. And then a few days later, they were asked to do it again, same task, again, which hadn't been started yet. Those time estimates differed by 71%. Let's look at another example here. Asylum decisions, to decide whether an immigrant trying to claim asylum should be given asylum or not. Those are very noisy. I call them refugee roulette because it's almost entirely dependent, not on your particular case, but on which judge you happen to get. To give an example, one judge whose performance was looked at over time granted asylum to 88% of the applicants. This is at one extreme. At the other extreme, a judge granted asylum 5% of the time. So that's the kind of variance you get in deciding asylum cases. Judges usually have very little time to do this. They get a few minutes with each individual and they make a decision. They make a judgment. We should let this person stay in the US or we shouldn't. And again, it's almost all noise. It has very little to do with whether in some absolute sense the person deserves to be given asylum or not. It has much, much more to do with the judge you happen to pick. Okay, let's look at a few more examples. Personnel decisions. Personnel decisions are more dependent on the decision maker than the person being evaluated. Again, personnel decisions are mainly noise. They have less to do with the qualifications of the person you're interviewing than they do with your own characteristics as an interviewer. Again, here's an example, some data that they report on in this book. So if you take 2 candidates and you compare them and you ask the interviewer, which of these 2 is a better choice for this job, which one will perform better on that job? And then they actually go back and look at the performance of these candidates, assuming both candidates eventually get hired. So they're making a judgment. Candidate A will perform better or B will. And then it's verifiable because 2 years later, you can go back and look at the performance of these candidates. The probability that the preferred choice, the one that the interviewer picked, actually ends up performing better on the job, depending on looking across a wide range of interviewers and interviews. The numbers range from 0.56 to 0.61. So it was better than chance. 50% is chance. If they were just guessing, they would have come up with 50%. So, but all of the interviewers evaluated fell within that range, 56 to 61%. So clearly, you're not very good at deciding who's going to do well on the job. You're a little better than chance, but really not much better. All right, another example. Bail and sentencing decisions. Bail has been getting a lot of attention lately, and people have talked about eliminating bail. Well, one of the reasons for that is because bail is highly variable across judges. It almost entirely depends on which judge you get, whether you're going to get bail or not. It depends far less on what you actually did. And the same is true of sentencing decisions. When a judge decides how many years to give you in prison, highly, highly variable across judges. I'm going to give some more data on that a little later. But one or two more examples. Forensic science, things like fingerprint analysis, even DNA analysis, surprisingly noisy. People used to think fingerprints were the absolute standard. You know, that's solid data. If your fingerprints are found at the scene of a crime, you were there, no doubt about it. Well, not so. Analysts make very different judgments looking at the same data. Different analysts looking at the same data make very different judgments. And even in DNA analysis, there's an uncomfortably high error rate in making a correct decision about whether the DNA found at the scene of the crime belongs to the person that is suspected of committing the crime. And in fact, some data on that, the Innocence Project, which some of you may be familiar with, has looked at lots and lots of cases of people getting released from prison because you were ultimately able to prove they were innocent. Forensic science contributed to 45% of wrongful convictions. So the misapplication of forensic science is what I meant to say. So in 45% of the cases that turned out to be wrongful commissions, an error was made in looking at the forensic data. That's really high, uncomfortably high. Okay, so that's enough of those examples. The idea of going through all that is to let you know that this noise is a real problem and it's all over the place, much more than people realize. Oh, there was one other example on here. Sorry, I forgot about it. Patent decisions, whether to grant a patent, very noisy, depending on who ends up looking at your patent application. You may and you may not get one. I mean, some of you know of some patent decisions that are really questionable, like genetic patents, for instance, where a cereal company is given rights to a particular genetic strain of a grain. And any farmer who happens to get that in his field can be sued for not paying for the right to use that grain. All right. So now that we know that there's a lot of noise out there, let's look at noise a little more closely. We're going to look at what's called level noise versus pattern noise. What is level noise? It's the variability of average judgments by different individuals. So let's go back to sentencing again, which is judges giving out sentences. Some judges are very strict. They give very long sentences for crime, for a given crime, compared to other judges who are very lenient. That's called level noise. It's how lenient or strict you are looked at across judges. But that's not the only kind of noise. There's also what's called pattern noise. Pattern noise has to do with the fact that even taking the severity of the judge into account and equalizing for that, there are still differences among judges in which crimes they tend to think deserve high sentences and which ones don't. And that is very idiosyncratic across judges. And so if level noise were the only thing that existed, then all judges looking at a given case wouldn't give the same term for a sentence. They would vary because of the level noise. But if you looked at a second case, the ranking of highest to lowest sentence should be the same if all you've got is level noise. So in fact, any cases you looked at, if it were only level noise that were creating differences, the rankings of all of those cases, the rankings from highest to lowest sentence, would all be the same. The fact that they aren't is due to pattern noise. And I'll say a little bit more about that. There are two kinds of pattern noise. There's what's called stable pattern noise, which is really the fact that the rankings given for a given case may differ across judges. You don't get the same ranking every time. But what's called stable pattern noise is due to the idiosyncrasies of the judge. However, there's another source of noise, and that's called occasion pattern noise. And that's different rankings across occasions. And this is something that is a scary kind of noise, because the judge might be in a good mood in the morning and give you a light sentence, be in a bad mood in the afternoon and give you a much heavier sentence. And there's data that's given in that book showing that, yes, that happens. Time of day has a very real effect on the length of sentences given to people. The weather has an effect. Whether it's a rainy, cold day or a nice, warm day, that makes a difference. Now, occasion noise isn't as bad as level noise and stable pattern noise. It's there and it exists, but it's stable pattern noise is a much bigger contributor to pattern noise than is occasion noise. But occasion noise is still scary. I mean, there's solid data showing that if you're going to go to a doctor for something that concerns you, go in the morning. In the afternoon, because of the way doctors' schedules work, they're usually backlogged by that time. And they usually have less time than that they're willing to give you to look at your case. If you catch them first thing in the morning, you're going to get more time with the doctor and you're going to get a more accurate diagnosis. That's just a known fact that's based on data that's been gathered over many years. And there are a lot of other things that affect doctors. He may be having a personal crisis at home. So anyway, these are all examples of what is called occasion noise. Now, we need to talk a little bit how we're going to measure these things. How do you measure system noise? And what I mean by system noise is the total amount of noise, not the bias. Bias isn't included in this. This is just the total amount of noise in a system, like say a set of sentences issued by a set of judges. System noise squared, I'll come back to that, is equal to the level noise squared plus the pattern noise squared. And again, just a touch of statistics, and this will, I think, be almost the end of the statistics. System noise is a standard deviation. It's the square root of mean squared error. System noise squared is what's called variance. If you've had statistics, that's variance. Variances are additive. So system noise, which is made up of level noise and pattern noise, the system noise variance is equal to the sum of the level noise and the pattern noise. So as they use the term in that book, this equation holds. The additivity of noise when you look at variances. But the actual measure they use for noise isn't standard, isn't variance. It's the standard deviation. It's the square root of the variance. And the reason for that is the square root of the variance is in the same units as the thing you're measuring. If you're measuring judges' sentences in years, the standard deviation of a sentence is measured in years, whereas the variance is measured in squared years. So that's why they take this square root. But once you take the square root, it isn't additive anymore. And I'll give you a little bit more on that. Now, pattern noise, which I had said earlier, is both stable pattern noise, idiosyncrasies across judges, and occasion pattern noise, variation across time of day, across weather, across anything else that can affect your decision making. Pattern noise is also additive at the variance level. Pattern noise variance is equal to stable noise variance plus occasion noise variance, okay? Now, what does that mean? Let's just stick with sentencing by judges. I made up a little mini example here to show what we're talking about. So here's a set of judges. There are 4 of them, and a set of cases. There were 4 of them. Cases, let's assume, were selected from very minor infractions up to relatively minor, up to relatively major infractions. So across cases, you expect the sentences to differ because they're different crimes. But looking across cases at judges, one judge, the most lenient one, gives an average sentence of 8.1 years. The strictest judge gives a judgment of 12.8 years. The average is 9.5 years. Now, if I compute the standard deviation of those 4 scores, those 4 averages, 8.1, 9.1, 8.2, 12.8, that's the level noise. And that turns out to be, again, looking at standard deviations, 1.92 years. And if you assumed for a moment that that severity of sentence judgments is normally distributed, and you know that the level noise is 1.92. Again, if you've had some statistics, you know that about 95% of the cases, a little less than that, I'm sorry, about 93 or 94, forgetting my normal distribution, fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. And so 95 of the cases of the sentences should fall within 1.84, I'm sorry, 3.84 years. Okay, so that's the level noise. How do you measure the pattern noise? Well, basically, statistically, you look at the variance in case A, the variance in case B, in case C, case D, you average those variances. That set of average variances is the system noise, the total amount of noise. And that, in this case, the variance turned out to be 7.23. We already know the level noise variance, which was 3.69. So the difference between those is the remaining pattern noise. Remember, they're additive. Pattern noise plus level noise equals system noise. And so you can see that once you look at standard deviations, the noise is about equally distributed between level noise, the severity of different judges, and pattern noise, their inconsistency of their rankings across cases due to the judges' idiosyncrasies. Okay, so that's just a little mini example. But actually, there was a study done back in 1981 that looked at 16 hypothetical cases that were created by the experimenters. And they drew data from 208 judges. So this is one of the biggest studies that's ever been done on sentencing that was carefully controlled. And so what they did is each of these 208 judges looked at these 16 different cases, came up with a decision on what the appropriate sentence was, and wrote that down. So each judge gave 16 numbers. So looking at this table here, the number of rows would have been 208 and the number of columns would have been 16. But they did the same thing with that data that I just did in this mini example. They calculated the level and the pattern noise. In this case, the level noise turned out to be 2.4 years. And coincidentally, the pattern noise turned out to be exactly the same, 2.4 years. So the total system noise, which is 3.39, was equally divided between level noise and pattern noise. And note that the system noise is not the sum of level noise and pattern noise, because that only applies to variances. So if you square each of those numbers, 2.4, 2.4, and you add them up, you'll get the square of 3.39. Trust me, it works. Anyway, so that's real data. And what that says is, if you look at 2 standard deviations, which would be 4.8 years, the level noise, that is the judges' mean, these 208 judges' mean across those 16 cases, was 2.8 years. So 2 standard deviations, or if I look, actually it's, to do my math right, for the normal distribution, it would be 1.96 standard deviation. So a little under 2.8 years included 95% of those 208 means. So there were 5% of the judges' average rating fell outside of 4.8 years differing from the mean. That is, don't mean to confuse here. If you looked at the mean across all the judges, the mean of this last column for 208 judges, 5% of the judges' average sentence differed from that mean by more than about 2.8 years. So that's a lot of variability in sentencing. Pattern noise, as I said, is the same. So the judges were very inconsistent in their rankings of the cases. So there was just as much pattern noise as there was level noise. Okay, enough of that now. Let's look just for a minute at the psychology of judgment and noise. It's a fact that confidence judgments are a very poor measure of the accuracy of judgments. If a judge says, you know, I'm really confident about this prediction I'm making about inflation next year, you can pretty much ignore that. There's lots of data showing that your confidence in your own judgments is a very poor predictor of how good that judgment really is. So, yeah, absolutely. But that's important because confidence, particularly when it comes from an expert, tends to convince people. If a doctor says, hey, there's no doubt that you have a malignant tumor here and I got to operate on you within the next 2 weeks. Hey, maybe, maybe not. But the mere fact that he's very confident should not weigh much at all in the decision you make about whether to have surgery or not. All right. And here's a fact that's been verified over and over again across many different domains. Simple rules and algorithms consistently outperform human judges. So, for instance, in sentencing, you could say, look, we're not going to leave it up just to the judge to just pull a number out of a hat. We're going to apply some simple rules. So, and that's been done in sentencing. There are rules as to how strict a sentence you can give or how lenient a one. And some of these rules are very good, and they're very well known to reduce noise because, again, study after study has shown if you put the simplest rule in effect, you'll generally end up with better decisions than leaving it up to a judge operating without any rules. But there are bad rules too. An example is the 3-strike rule that was put into effect. 3 felonies and that's it. You're done. You're in prison without parole. That turned out to be a pretty bad rule. Judges hated the rule, but they were forced to operate under it. So not all rules are good, but there is something about rules and algorithms you need to know. They're noise free. There is no noise in a rule. Other examples of rules are in hiring. You might break down a hiring decision to a set of criteria. How good is this person likely to be on the job? How strong is their resume? What's their education look like? There are various things you can pull out. Now, in a typical interview, you try to take all these things into account and you come up and you make a decision about whether you want to hire somebody or not. But in some companies, and I'll give an example later from Google, they apply a fairly strict rule. They put a particular weight on each of those categories. You're required to assign a score to each of the separate categories. And then those scores are added up to give a total score. And the rule allows no variation. You're required to apply the weights given and add them all up to get the total score. And then the hiring decision is ultimately based on that total score. So if you see somebody making a judgment that doesn't involve any underlying rules, any underlying algorithms, or maybe even not any very good guidelines. I'll come back to guidelines later, which are weaker than rules and algorithms. If a judge is making a judgment without information of that kind, it's known that that judgment isn't as good as the judgment you would get with a rule or an algorithm. And again, this applies to across the board. There have been studies done that selectively pick experts, judges known in their field for being very, very good. And even if you look at that subset of experts, still the rules will outperform the expert judgment of that group of judges. That's important to know. Okay. Another thing that's well known from data. If you're judging somebody on a simple dimension, and let's say, how strong is this individual's resume when you're trying to hire them and you have to provide a rating to that resume, that's not too hard to do. And judges are pretty good at that, and judges will generally agree. There won't be, the judges might vary in the score they give, and I'll come back to that later. But they'll generally always rank them the same way. But that gets much harder to do if there are multiple dimensions involved, and particularly when you look at the multiple dimensions and they don't all agree with one another. So if somebody comes in with a strong resume, but their college GPA is actually fairly low. So that's conflicting information. Judges are particularly bad at using that information. And and it's ironic because judges think that that's the one thing they're particularly good at, deciding when there are conflicts among the information, how to evaluate it. They're not good at it. A simple rule that just adds up the ratings will work much better than the judgment of even a highly experienced interviewer. Okay, let's see. I'm doing on time here. I'm all right for the moment. Okay. Now, how do you reduce noise and bias? Bias, I'm going to talk a little about something called ex post and ex ante biasing. I'm going to talk about something called decision hygiene. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of a decision observer. I'll come back to each of these. Ex post and ex ante debiasing. So ex post or corrective debiasing means correcting a known bias in a judgment after the fact. So a supervisor might get an estimate of how long a given project's going to take from his or her group, and might add time to that estimate just because of the known, what's called the planning fallacy. People consistently underestimate the time it's going to take to do a complex task. It's just a fact. And so a supervisor might know that and might just add a month to the project to correct for that. And that's called ex post or corrective debiasing. But there's something called ex ante debiasing. You can do something like providing nudges or boosting. Let me explain that. A nudge, an example of a nudge that you do before the fact is having auto enrollment in pension plans. It's, again, a well-known fact that if you look at a company that has you opt into a pension plan, that is, make a conscious decision that, yes, I'm going to be part of the pension plan, they have to sign something that says so. And you compare it to opting out. You have to actually sign a form saying you don't want to be in the pension plan. You get a much higher enrollment in the pension plan with opting out than with opting in. And again, that's a well-known fact. So that's called the nudge. So, something you do before the fact to correct for a bias. The bias in this case being status quo. People are very biased towards leaving things the way they are and not having to make a decision. Well, if you have to opt into the pension plan, that's a decision. You actually have to do something. Doing nothing is generally the preferred mode of operation. If you have to opt out, same thing. You're much more likely to do nothing, but that gets you into the pension plan in this case. Okay, so that's a nudge. Boosting, what's boosting? That's basically providing training in advance to eliminate known biases. So an example would be teaching decision makers about the kinds of noise, what their sources are, and what they mean statistically, and maybe even giving them a short statistics course so they understand these things. That's giving a boost to eliminate a bias. Anyway, that's enough on that, since that really isn't the focus of their book. Okay, decision hygiene. I'm going to talk about 5 things. 6. There are 6 things that they talk about in this book as ways to eliminate or at least lessen noise in judgments. One thing is to suppress individual expression. And you do that by using rules, algorithms, or even guidelines. Guidelines leaving a lot more room for the judge to make a decision, but still providing some guidance in how to do it. If you don't use rules, algorithms, or even guidelines, then you are guaranteed to increase the noise. Judges, judging is a noisy operation. Think statistically, take an outside view. I'll come back to that. Well, in fact, actually, I'm going to talk about each one. I had already told you that rules and algorithms are by definition free of noise. When there is a lot of data, there's been a lot of recent work with machine learning algorithms that learn over time. And machine algorithms are known to do better than simple rules. You know, they do better than simple rules. Simple rules still do better than humans. Even a simple rule that doesn't even involve any weighting. You just assign scores to, say, 4 or 5 dimensions and you add them up. You don't even weight them. There are a lot of statistical ways of looking at data and applying that data to come up with good weights for the dimensions. But even if you don't do that, you'll still end up with less noisy decisions than if you just leave it up to a human to make the decision. An example is in personnel performance rating, 3/4 of personnel decisions are system noise, and 1/4 actually have to do with the performance of the individual you're rating. So if you've ever been a manager, every year you have to give performance ratings to the people under you. I hated doing it. The people being rated hate getting rated. And the decisions that raters make are very poor. It's mainly noise, 3/4 noise, only 1/4 of it has to do with the performance of the individual you're rating. So that's important to know. And this is largely because different raters have completely different ideas of what a good performance is or great performance. And often, you know, when you sit down to discuss your ratings of personnel with other managers, you have to use a scale like this. Well, this person is fair, good, great, poor, whatever. Very poor scales because nobody agrees on what those words really mean. Okay. To improve that with just even a simple guideline, you can give anchor cases. You can, rather than just making an absolute judgment, okay, this person performed very well against their performance targets. You use a rating scale that has an anchor. And that anchor could be, say, 2 or 3 people that have been with the company for a long time, and all of the raters, all of the supervisors know very well. And you come to a consensus agreement that these 3 well-known people, where they fall on this scale of poor up to great. And you put them on that scale. And then everyone else is evaluated relative to those 3 known cases. When you provide anchors like that as a guideline, you get a much better decision than if you don't provide that kind of guideline. Okay. Think statistically, take an outside view. Causal thinking is our normal way of thinking, but noise is not causal. It's inherently statistical. By causal thinking, when you, again, are trying to judge somebody or something, and you're looking at 2 different judgments you make, you try to find the underlying causes of the differences in your ratings. That's a natural thing to do. But noise isn't like that. Noise is due to underlying characteristics that are primarily just plain statistical. There is no underlying causal story that's going to explain the differences among a group of judges. Let me give you an example here. So I'm going to read you something. Bill is 33 years old. He's an intelligent, guy, but he's unimaginative. He's compulsive and generally lifeless in school. He was strong in math, but weak in social studies and humanities. Based on this description, what makes more sense to you of the two statements I'm about to make? Bill fits your idea of a person who plays jazz as a hobby. That's one of the statements. Or Bill fits your idea of an accountant who plays jazz as a hobby. So based on that description I gave you, which of those two statements would you tend to go with if you had to pick one or the other? Yeah, most people would pick the second. Okay. But now let me ask a slightly different question. Which of those two statements, based on the description I gave you, is the most probable of the two? If you had to assign a probability to it, it's the first. And that's a mathematical fact based on the fact that accountants who play jazz as a hobby are a subset of all those people who play jazz as a hobby. So clearly, the probability that a person plays jazz as a hobby is more likely than he's an accountant who plays jazz as a hobby. But this illustrates something, again, getting back to causal thinking. You substitute an easier question for a harder one. The hard question is judging probability, because people aren't very good at probability. The easy question is judging similarity. Which one seems more similar to the description I gave? And it's that second statement, which on a similarity scale is higher than the first statement. It's just that turns out to be wrong when it comes down to probabilities. So you substituted an easy question, similarity, for a harder one, probability. Happens all the time. Anyway, going on, I'll get through the rest of this quickly because I know I'm starting to run over. Taking the outside view means looking at any case you're making a judgment on as a member of a class of similar cases. So rather than looking at your particular case as being unique, which is what ironically people want you to do. If you're being judged, if a doctor's looking at you, you want that doctor to view you as an individual, to take everything about you into account. But that's not what a doctor should really do. What a doctor should do is say, hey, look, this is somebody who is exhibiting the following symptoms. And based on my years of experience with other people who have similar systems, this is the diagnosis I'm going to make. That's taking an outside view as opposed to saying, well, you know, what I know about this individual, from what I know about this individual, I know his lifestyle is rotten. He drinks too much. So, you know, I'm going to make a decision based on that. The outside view is the better way to go. And I've already talked about substituting a simple question for a harder one. A really important thing is not to ignore base rates. Going back to that bill example I just gave you. Based on the description, estimate the probability that Bill is an accountant. So remember that description I gave about Bill. So if you had to guess whether if you had to say, what's the probability that that guy ended up being an accountant, you might come up with a number, or you might not be able to. But the fact is, if you know the base rate, you'll make a much better guess. The base rate happens to be that there are 1.27 million accountants in the United States out of a population of, you know, what are we now, 350 million. Eliminate minors, eliminate the retired, so you can cut that down to somewhere over 200 million. Still, there's less than a 1% chance that Bill is in fact an accountant. But there just aren't that many accountants relative to the whole population. That's looking at the base rate. People are notorious in making decisions in ignoring base rates or not knowing what the base rate in a judgment is. Okay. Avoid non-regressive prediction. This gets statistical again, and I'll go over it very quickly. The idea is basically let's say you're told that a young girl reads at 4 years old. It could read fluently at 4. And let's say you in fact know that puts her in about the 90th percentile of 4-year-olds. And now you're asked, well, Julie's now in college. What would you predict her GPA to be? Well, what people tend to do is to say, well, I know that she was in the 90th percentile as a 4-year-old. So let's assume she's still in the 90th percentile. And let's say she has a GPA of maybe 3.8. Not in the top 5%, but maybe in the 90th percentile. Is that a good prediction? The answer is no. The reason it isn't a good prediction is because it ignores something known as regression to the mean. It ignores the fact that the correlation between where she was as a 4-year-old and what her GPA will be as an adult is at best about 0.2%. I'm sorry, 0.20, about 20%. That's the correlation. If the correlation were perfect, yes, then you could say, well, she was in the 90th percentile as a kid. She's still in the 90th percentile when I look at her GPA. If the correlation was 0, what would your guess be? Well, if there were no correlation, your best guess would be the mean GPA. You know, you have nothing else to go on. What's the mean GPA in the school this person goes to? So to adjust for the correlation, you basically take the difference between the mean score and the 90th percentile score, and you discount it by multiplying by 0.2. And then you take that number, add it to the mean. That's your best prediction. So it'll be much lower than the prediction, the original prediction I made. Anyway, that's called when I ignore the correlation, it's called a non-regressive prediction. I'm not taking into account the fact that the two things I'm comparing are not well correlated. Okay, I'll quickly go through the rest of this. Structuring judgments into several independent tasks is a great way to eliminate noise. And a structured judgment is characterized by decomposing into pieces, and very importantly, by independence. That is, each piece is rated independently of the other ones to the extent possible, and then delaying a holistic judgment. That is, your final decision on whether to hire somebody, for instance, is not made until you've looked at the data that comes as a result of decomposing, assigning scores to the dimensions, and adding them up. Here's an example that from Google. Google actually does this. Google has 4 components to assessing a job applicant: general cognitive ability, leadership, cultural fit, role-related knowledge. When they interview somebody, it's a structured interview. They don't ask a bunch of open-ended questions. They're required to ask questions related to each of these categories, and they're required, once the interview's done, to assign a score to each of those 4 categories. And they do that before they talk to anybody else about that candidate. So each interviewer, Google generally has about 4 people interview you. Those 4 interviewers' ratings are independent of one another. That turns out to be very important. Again, that greatly reduces the noise. One thing Google found is when they knew their judgments, their hiring decisions were pretty bad, they had data that showed them that. They put this structure in place. But what they did before that, they decided, well, we have to have more people interview. And you could end up getting interviewed by as many as 20 different people. And what they found pretty early on was that anything above 4 different people is not going to provide any new information that's of any use. Okay, resist premature intuitions. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but basically what it means is, and they do this a lot in forensic sciences because of knowing about biases. They give you the data on which you base your judgment in a particular order. And it's because it's known that initial information strongly influences the interpretation of subsequent information. Let me give you a real simple example. A job candidate might be described as, let's say you're told this about a person. This guy's coming in and I think he's very intelligent. This is somebody who knows him, who's talking to you. I think he's very intelligent, very persistent. He's also cunning and he's unprincipled. Okay, well, conflicting information. Instead, in talking to somebody, you give the information in a different order. You say, hey, this guy you're about to interview, he's unprincipled, he's cunning, and yeah, he's intelligent and he's persistent. Turns out, given those two descriptions, you'll make very different judgments. The initial information strongly influences how you interpret later information. That's a very simple example, but for instance, in doing fingerprint analysis, they found out and they do this now, you avoid giving, you may ask a fingerprint analyst, does this fingerprint that I'm showing you, gathered on the scene of a crime, match this individual? So the cops may have a suspect, and they got that suspect's fingerprint, and they've got a fingerprint from the scene of the crime. And the fingerprint analysis has to compare the two. What you don't tell the fingerprint analyst, ideally the fingerprint analyst knows nothing at all about the suspect. Simply that this is a comparison that you're going to make with this fingerprint from the scene of the crime. If you tell them in advance, yeah, we think we've got the guy, we arrested him fleeing from the scene, and then you ask him to compare fingerprints, you'll get a different judgment about that fingerprint than if you don't tell them that. And there are lots of other cases of some relevant and some irrelevant information that, if you know it in advance, can end up really biasing your judgment. So anyway, that's the essence of linear sequential unmasking. Give people the most relevant data first, and the data that's less relevant to a final decision later, or not at all, maybe. Anyway, let me quickly go on with that. And basically, don't come to a conclusion before you've got all the facts. It's very easy to do that, and we do it all the time. When you're interviewing somebody, the first few minutes might tell you, I like this guy. I like the way he dresses. I like the way he looks. You know, I can ignore a few things that I learn later that don't seem to fit my overall impression. Don't let that initial impression influence your subsequent decision. Get all the data in, evaluate all of it before making a decision. Control the discussion agenda. All that means is usually all the interviewers sit down and they make a judgment after discussing the individual. Control the agenda. If you're in charge of that group, control the discussion. Don't let irrelevant information get into the discussion. Make sure the most relevant information is discussed first. And if you've done a structured interview, look at each of the dimensions separately and get a consensus on each dimension before you aggregate it. Anyway, enough of that. And I'll go through this very quickly. Obtain independent judgments from multiple judges, then aggregate. Aggregated independent judgments are much better than non-aggregated. But independence is an important critical fact. If you have a bunch of people sit down to make a decision, then whoever the loudest talker will make the most influence on that decision. So the judgments need to be independent. Quick example. In 1907, a well-known guy named Galton, who was related to Darwin, as it turns out, asked 787 villagers at a fair to guess the weight of a prize ox. The weight was actually 1,198 pounds. The mean guess across all those 787 villagers was 1,200 pounds compared to 1,198. The median was 1,207. The individual estimates before the aggregation were very noisy. They were all over the place. But the average turned out to be very accurate. And that is generally true. As long as the judgments are independent, as long as each person makes their guess without knowing what anybody else said. So collect individual judgments before any general discussion among judges. Average independent judgments across judges before you sit down and discuss a final decision. The average of independent estimates may well be more accurate than the consensus judgment following the general discussion. It's interesting that Google discovered that they actually made better hiring decisions when they didn't allow a discussion among the individuals after the interviews. But they do it anyway. They have the general discussion anyway. And that's because the people interviewing just couldn't stand not sitting down and talking about what they had learned. And so they still let them do it, but they discount, they know what the data tells them going in, and they know what comes out of the discussion. And they're careful not to let the discussion get out of hand. They control the discussion very carefully. Finally, favor relative judgments and relative scales. Relative judgments are less noisy than absolute judgments. People are much better at making relative judgments. People are much better at making pairwise comparisons than they are at making individual judgments on a scale. So if you have two candidates and you say, which one do you prefer? Judges generally agree on that. But if you simply say, assign this candidate a level on a scale from poor to great, an absolute scale, people are much worse at that. They're much better at making comparisons. And anchor cases, as I discussed earlier, go a long way to reducing noise. I'm going to skip this last thing. What it had to do with was just the idea that you can bring in a trained decision observer to watch a group of people make a decision, and you can actually evaluate them in real time. So when you see bias creeping in, you can actually tell them that you're aware of that. If you see too much diversity of views, you can, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it. You want diversity of views. If you don't see enough diversity, you want to check that. And the book will tell you several other things there, but I'm going to skip that for now because I'm running way over and I'm done. Okay, questions?
Just can I get a? You take this because we'll need that.
There we go.
All right, for questions and comments.
See, my estimate of the time this talk was going to take was biased way low.
All right.
Yeah. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Still there.
John, I just wanted to say you did a really good job. That's a really tough task to explain a book to people who aren't able to look at it visually. And that was really clear to follow. I'm not saying I remember all the statistics. That part, it was really clear to follow.
Well, thank you.
Nice job.
I do recommend that anybody who had their interest piqued, take a look at the book. It's well worth reading. There are lots of examples. I didn't have time to go over.
judge who gets transplants, which is life and death, and the variables from education, economic status, support system, health, how long they might live. So all these different things go into the judgment. I want to say there's been a lot of criticism of algorithms for bias and prejudice by the people that make them.
A lot of the criticism for what again?
Bias and prejudice in people that draw up algorithms.
Yeah.
And of course, on mandatory sentencing, there's been criticism there also. I don't like the term noise. I wish they'd use something like influences or another
I'm
word.
trying to miss that. What don't you like?
Noise, the comment, the word noise to describe all those different things. I don't think it fits. That's all.
Okay. I'm not sure I can repeat the question accurately.
Well, where's the other question?
So,
There wasn't
yeah,
any
so
question.
you were saying
Who else?
you don't
I don't like the term noise.
You don't like the term noise. I got you. And why don't you like the term noise?
I don't think it fits.
Why doesn't it fit?
You use noise in a different context.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, it's a noisy crowd standing outside the bar.
All right.
But noise, in statistics, noise has a specific meaning.
John has a question or a comment.
I just want to follow up with what Hugh said. I have a feeling the algorithms probably are very good at reducing noise, but reducing bias, they might even not be so good at that. They might even increase it.
Yeah,
But
I have to be careful about differentiating between bias and noise. Certain kinds of bias, actually in this book, are treated as noise. If you look across a set of judges, they may all have individual biases that go in various directions. And those tend to cancel each other out as noise. It's when they don't cancel out, that is, if they're all biased against poor people, for instance, and you look at the average of all their ratings, and they consistently rate poor people differently than less poor people. That's a bias. But individually, there might be a whole bunch of biases in there that get canceled out by averaging. And that's treated as noise in this book.
okay. The other thing,
Noise, by the way, getting back to Hugh, noise, if you want a better word, use variability. Variability is what they're calling noise here.
okay. The other thing, did the authors go in the book go very far into the subject of noise and public opinion polling? I think there'd probably be a lot in that public opinion polling.
I didn't catch that. Repeat it.
Did the authors deal much with the possible subject of noise and public opinion polling?
In
Public opinion
noise and
polling.
opinions polls. No, actually, they didn't. They were really quite focused here on professional judgments. Because those are the ones that really have an impact on people's lives, professional judgment. Polls, you're right, they could have talked about polls and about noise in polls, and polls tend to be very noisy. And they can be biased too. I mean, the famous case is back in the Truman-Dewey election, a polling organization called people on the phone to get polling information. Well, back when Truman and Dewey were running, a lot of people didn't have phones, particularly rural people and poorer people. And so they got a very biased result in favor of Dewey. And they came out with a strong prediction that Dewey was going to win the election. That was biased. It wasn't noisy, it was biased. I'm sorry? I got hearing aids in and
That would be a bias in favor of more employed people, ones who back to be on the phone.
say that again.
said, that it
Yeah.
biases it towards affluent people.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right. Yeah, they were highly biased towards affluent people who tilted towards republicanism, who tilted towards duty. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the statistical approach and looking at how you are being very analytical about making these choices that you have to make. But does this methodology that seems to be suggested lead to a kind of mediocrity in the sense that you're going to get a more consistent, but maybe you're finding a mean rather than the stellar employee that you really want. In other words, would Einstein be selected by Google's algorithm? Probably not.
Maybe not.
So,
probably wouldn't
and
fit in
he
with
could
Google,
have,
yeah,
maybe
anyway.
he could have transformed that company into
Maybe.
some superior thing.
So
So-
what you're saying is reducing noise may lead you to missing the best person
Well,
for a job?
maybe there's an advantage to noise is really what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well,
And
in
when
fact,
you
they-
eliminate it, you
they-
end up with a nice comfy mean.
They address that in this book.
Okay,
And
how so?
that's why they're saying, even though rules and algorithms work much better than humans, they're not saying that that's the way we should go in all situations. They're saying people have this need to have their intuitions about decisions play into that decision. And if they're told to completely ignore their intuitions altogether, they hate it. And in fact, that's why judges tend to hate sentencing guidelines. Guidelines, sentencing rules, guidelines they can deal with because they have some flexibility. And that's why in this book they say, hey, look, all right, even though rules will probably work better, go for guidelines as a way to allow the individual judges to feel their intuitions have a voice in the decision. But it doesn't ignore the fact that the more the human plays a role in that decision, the more noisy decisions across judges are going to be. That's just a fact. I mean, I might be a harsh judge that feels, look, all these judges are wrong. Society's better off by getting these malcreants in prison and off the street. And that's my intuition. And I believe I have years of experience that tells me that's the right thing to do. And that's all well and good, but that contributes to noise, the level noise in sentences given. And it's unconscionable that in this country, for a particular crime, one person can get probation, 2 years probation, and another can be given actual life in prison for the same crime. It happens. It has happened in this country. That shouldn't. And these noise reduction strategies will prevent that from happening.
I've got a question from Jennifer, who is attending via Zoom. I hope I can get her question correct. Because how do we assess the evidence-based guidelines? That is, Facebook has had to keep revising its process. So how can we use evidence-based guidelines to reduce noise and bias?
Say that again. What kind of guidelines?
Evidence-based.
Evidence-based guidelines. Yeah, well, it clearly can be used. Guidelines are just a little looser than rules and algorithms. They do just that. They provide guidance to the person making the decision while allowing some degree of individual flexibility. Now, the data shows that the stronger those guidelines, the less they allow human discretion, the less noisy will be the final decisions. I repeat a fact that I stated earlier. Rules and algorithms are noise-free. There is no noise in them. That doesn't mean they're good. I mean, it's a noiseless algorithm to say, everybody we catch for shoplifting, we chop off their left hand. That's a clear rule. It's noiseless, but a terrible rule, obviously. And so they address that in the book. They say, look, you got to be careful in picking your rules to ensure that they're accomplishing the goal which you're trying to accomplish, which is reducing noise without creating extreme unfairness in some sense.
I'm going to ask a comment. I'll preface this by saying that I have not read the book, but it seems to me that they are applying stochastic processes in systems that are inherently non-stochastic. You're talking about normal distribution.
You have to slow down a little bit. Again, my hearing aids aren't working too well.
But my problem, what I see from whatever you have, which is a condensed version of what they have said, is that they are applying stochastic analysis to non-stochastic processes. You are talking about mean, mode, medium, normal distribution, and all these issues that you're talking about are not free, are not stochastic. So why don't they do, there are ways of determining non-stochastic noises. You can do multivariate analysis. You can do all sorts of things.
Say that last piece again.
You can do noise analysis, if you're going to call it noise, as non-stochastic process. You can do multivariate analysis. There are a lot of very powerful statistical tools.
Yeah, sure.
So that application of what seems to be that your noise is random in this case, I don't have to.
But it's not random.
But if it is not random, then how can you apply statistical techniques? Especially
Sure you
mean
can.
or median.
Yeah.
It is not a normal distribution. I mean,
Again, much of what they did, the report in this book, much of the results in reducing noise were based on standard techniques like multivariate analysis, analysis of variance, and I would argue that you can't really call the data they're working on non-stochastic. It's stochastic if you can't pin down, if you can't do a causal analysis to tell you why the noise is there. And that's their whole point. That's what humans want to do. They want to do causal analysis. And what they're saying is, for noise in particular, as opposed to bias, a causal analysis isn't going to do you any good. I skipped a whole piece in their book because we didn't have time. But they have a whole appendix on something called, I want to make sure I get their term right, decision analysis. Hang on. No, I'm sorry. The part I skipped is called a noise audit. What they're saying is really the first thing you should do if you're called in a given situation is do a noise audit. And what that means is sit down, gather as much data as you can to try to determine where noise exists in whatever system you're looking at. So that's what happened with judges giving sentences. There was a guy, and I forgot his name, it's in the book, who several years ago did a noise audit of sentencing. And that study was a real eye-opener for judges and the legal system in general, because it showed how much noise there was in sentencing, and nobody believed it. Judges believed not only that they were internally consistent in the way they gave sentences, but that their sentencing was consistent with what other judges would do. Well, both of those things turned out to be utterly false. The judges were very confident that they were making good decisions based on good data and that other judges would agree with them. Their confidence was totally misplaced and it just wasn't true. So that was part of doing the noise audit, figuring, first of all, how much noise is there? In this case, there was a lot of it. Where's it coming from? What can we do to reduce it? So there's a whole appendix that deals with how to do a noise audit, how to sit down and go through a system to figure out where the noise is. And it involves applying many of the principles that I briefly discussed. But again, I could only give the tip of the iceberg with respect to what they're trying to accomplish here. That's why I say if this really matters in any sense to you, if you care about it, it's worth reading the book and looking at the data they have.
Good, John. Yes, sir.
All right. Now, I want to talk about Cass Sunstein, one of the authors of your book.
Cass Sunstein,
Yeah. You said he was from Harvard.
Sunstein, hang on, let me just review. Yeah, he's a professor at Harvard. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He wrote a book called Nudge with another co-author.
Well, I remember the name. I haven't heard much from him since the Clinton years, but during the Clinton years, I believe Cass Sunstein did something very naughty. And I can't remember what it is. I'm wondering if you recall any politics that came from him, and also that if he is from Harvard, that is a negative attribute, quite possibly, because Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, these are all conservative institutions, and yet whenever there's an attachment to these names of these institutions, there's this assumed positive status.
I understand.
And
Yeah,
I just want to make a.
But
make
you don't
it-
remember what
Yeah, that's why
this
I
guy
was
did.
I was wondering if you remember the only prominence in my mind that attaches to his name is this naughty event, just like Larry Summers,
Yeah, I
president
know.
of
I
Harvard.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he has some very
Yeah,
very
if your point is that Cass Sunstein is not a perfect individual and there's ghosts in his closet, yeah, probably true of all these authors.
Okay.
But what I do like is the fact that there were three authors from three different fields who came to a consensus in writing this book. And so you got to hope that the individual flaws of any one of them got somewhat counterbalanced by the other two authors. Is it true? I don't know.
Any other questions? No, all right, thank you, John.
And my apologies for running so long. I did a rehearsal and I said half an hour tops. Yeah, I know. See, I should have applied one of their techniques and said, okay, I'm adding 20 minutes to my estimate. I should have done that, but I didn't.
That's all right, John. It was a very interesting talk, and thank you. We shall ignore your incorrect noise estimations. All right, so since Jay has saved us a lot of time and given us time to hear John, announcements. John, do we know who the next week?
It's the gentleman that Chris found, Jim, yeah, what's his last name?
You already mic'd up, I didn't notice.
Oh, yeah, B-U-I-E. Dewey. Yeah, either do I. I wrote him again today to encourage him to actually tell me. I'd written him a week ago asking for that information.
He's a professor of something. I
Yeah.
forget what, but he's well knowledgeable.
I do know from the information you shared, he has a lot of international experience. And it sounded like he might decide he wants to talk about his overseas experience in the Middle East, but he may surprise me. I don't know. I told him, though, that we had to have the information by tomorrow, that we really needed to.
Any other announcements? All right then. our program comes to an end, but our fellowship continues. So we'll be meeting here next Sunday. And I'll see you then. Bye.
Okay, gotcha.
And 7